Friends, hello. Today we are starting with drugs in general, and we will also finish today's episode with them. The topic is the Opium Wars. You know, in the history of different states, there are periods that are embarrassing or outright humiliating to recall. The Opium Wars, or the Century of Humiliation, as they are called in China, are exactly such a historical segment that China remembers to this day. We will come back to it at the end of the episode. This is the period that China will never forgive the West for, and it is the period from which the roots of the current conflict between China and Europe and the United States of America grow. As for the other side of the conflict, England, Great Britain, the USA, and partly France, it has somehow become customary not to remember this period at all, because it really is a shameful thing. It is completely inhumane, arrogant, and it shows as well as possible the true nature of geopolitics, the true nature of economic interests and state ambitions. So, the Opium Wars. At the beginning of the 19th century, China was the richest country in the world. 35% of global GDP belonged to the Qing China of that time. For comparison, today the American economy accounts for 25% of the entire world GDP. That is, China was the richest power. Besides the fact that China produced various items and goods that were of interest to Europe, for example, porcelain, spices, silk, and especially tea, which was of great interest to Great Britain, China was also a huge market. Western powers naturally sought to trade there, but China was completely isolated. When the envoys of the English King George arrived at the court of the Chinese Emperor Qianlong to negotiate new trade rules, the Emperor of China told them, "Thanks to heaven and earth, we have everything we need, and the strange barbaric goods of your countries are of no use to us." Indeed, the Chinese emperor treated Europeans as barbarians, as white monkeys, and treated his neighbors as vassals with considerable contempt. And indeed, China needed nothing from Europe, whereas Great Britain needed a great deal from China. Let's start with the fact that a huge amount of tea began to be imported from China, and literally during the 18th century, a real tea revolution took place in Great Britain. There is even a theory that the hard-drinking British Isles switched to tea, and this actually contributed to the sobering of the nation and the economic rise of Great Britain in the 19th century. I don't claim it is absolutely true, but such a version exists. The British imported enormous quantities of tea from China. At that time, the saying appeared, "I won't do it for all the tea in China, that is, not for any money." And the British paid China for this tea in silver. Of course, it would be more profitable to pay with some other goods, but China remained a closed territory. Foreigners were allowed only in one port, Guangzhou. They were not allowed further onto the mainland. There were English and American trading factories in Guangzhou, and they traded with Chinese merchants. They were forbidden to settle on the mainland. If they were on long business trips, they were forbidden to bring their families so that people would not put down roots in Chinese soil at all. Great Britain's economic policy at that moment was very simple. The trade balance had to be strictly in favor of Great Britain. We must sell more than we buy so that we have a positive trade balance. But again, China needed nothing. The monopoly on the tea trade belonged to the greatest corporation in the world at that time, the East India Company. It was based in India, but traded with all neighboring territories, including China, and brought silk, spices, porcelain. The most important part was that Great Britain paid for tea with silver. And so the British, from whom the Chinese needed nothing, tried to find a product that could be exchanged for tea, because huge amounts of silver were already being exported to China in exchange for tea. This began to undermine the pound, sterling, and the entire British economy. They tried completely different goods. Precious stones. China itself had plenty of jade, which was valued mainly only there, all kinds of valuable furs. Yes, they were imported too, but in reality they did not provide the East India Company with any major source of income. And then opium came onto the scene. Today, opium is very closely associated with China. All those opium dens in London and San Francisco, for example, had Chinese staff, and everything became associated with China. In fact, of course, China had nothing to do with opium. It did not originate there. Opium originated in the Middle East. It was brought to China long ago by Arab merchants and used as a medicine for insomnia, During operations, as we know, opium contains morphine, a painkiller used during surgery and for sleep disorders, etc. In China and the Middle East, it was known only as a medicine. But later people began to smoke opium, mixing it with tobacco. Such a mixture was called medak and gave a mild euphoric effect. Over time, a habit formed, and science did not stand still. At some point, they learned to purify opium to increase the narcotic content. In fact, they learned to make heroin, and at that moment, opium became a popular recreational drug. At the beginning of the 19th century, the British brought the first opium to China, and it very quickly became an extremely popular drug. It must be said that the British East India Company had fast ships, the famous clippers that could sail through tropical storms. They were mainly called tea clippers because they carried tea from China to Great Britain. From India to China, they carried drugs. To finish the tea story, since the Chinese considered the British and all white people barbarians, they sold them low-quality tea. They called it red tea. We call it black tea. While keeping the good high mountain green teas for themselves, let the white monkeys smoke this garbage. Yet that same garbage became a delicacy in Great Britain. So the first crates of opium arrived in China. The Chinese got hooked on the drug, and smoking it became fashionable. First, of course, merchants, officials, and army officers stationed in Guangzhou, near the English factories, started smoking it. The first opium dens appeared, and then the drug began to spread across the whole country. This is an absolutely astonishing story because the Chinese emperors and the higher authorities completely missed the opium danger. It started at the beginning of the 19th century, and by the 1830s China was already addicted. First the upper class smoked it, officials, officers, merchants, then the imperial court, then ordinary people once they learned to dilute it properly to reduce the cost. The drug began to devour the entire country. The profit was fantastic. A crate of opium cost 130 pounds at auction in Calcutta and was sold for 600 pounds in China. The East India Company became fabulously rich from the opium trade. Just one figure. In 1837, the British delivered 2,535 tons of opium to China and received 592 tons of silver for it. First, they exchanged opium for tea and earned twice, once on opium, then on tea sold in Britain. Later, tea was no longer enough, and China began paying pure silver for opium. Even the emperor's court got addicted. To make it clear, 20% of all British imports at that time was opium. When we now talk about Colombian or Afghan drug traffickers, understand that this was simply state policy supported by everyone. The Chinese emperor realized too late that the drug had engulfed the country. Around drugs, an entire empire of traders, middlemen, and dealers instantly grew, and above all, massive corruption, because every official and officer who touched the opium network began to profit from it. On the one hand, they were killing their own population with drugs. On the other, they were destroying the economy with corruption and constant silver outflow to the British. It became a real national tragedy. Even Manchu princes smoked opium. 20% of officials were addicts, a catastrophic figure. In 1839, the emperor closed the market to merchants from India and Great Britain. A special official, Lin Zexu, was sent to Guangzhou with orders to stop the opium trade. He confiscated all the opium stored in the East India Company warehouses, more than 20,000 chests, and destroyed it by throwing it into the sea. First performing a ritual apology to the sea. "Forgive us, dear sea, for defiling you with this devilish potion." By that time, the clippers were already called devil ships in China, and the drug itself, Jesus opium. But it was too late. The British protested. The emperor ignored them. How can the emperor of the Celestial Empire talk to barbarians? In 1840, a British squadron appeared off the coast of China. 17 sailing ships and 4 steamships. It moved north along the coast, shelling cities, landing troops, seizing ports. China's huge army was scattered across the country, hadn't fought in ages, and was technically far inferior. For example, in 1841, near the village of Senyuanli, an English detachment of only 800 men was surrounded by a 100,000-strong Chinese army, and the Chinese still couldn't win because the British were more disciplined and better armed. In the spring of 1842, the British captured Shanghai and forced the emperor to sign the Treaty of Nanking on August 29, 1842, the first unequal treaty. Britain received a multi-million-pound indemnity in silver, the island of Hong Kong in perpetuity, 5 Chinese ports open for British trade Xiamen, Fuzhou, Ningbo, Shanghai, etc. There is not a single word about opium in the treaty, just opening for trade. Customs barriers were removed, and the flow of opium increased many times over. In China, the Treaty of Nanking was seen as national humiliation. A civil war began, supported from all sides by Europeans, French, British, and Americans. The Americans by that time were also present in China, taking about 10% of the opium market. When the British blocked access to Indian opium, the Americans brought cheaper, lower-quality Turkish opium, still a huge business. The Second Opium War. The British wanted more and quickly found a pretext, the Arrow Incident. Together with the French, they completely captured Guangzhou, then the Daegu forts and the large port of Tianjin, and marched toward Beijing. The Chinese army suffered defeat after defeat. The emperor fled the capital. The Summer Palace, the famous imperial residence, was looted and burned by noble British and French officers. Everything of value, ancient relics, porcelain, jade, was taken and dispersed among European gentlemen. New treaties were signed. Tianjin Treaty, Beijing Treaties, opium trade was fully legalized, now officially the same normal craft as tea trading. Foreigners accused of crimes in China could no longer be tried by Chinese courts. They were handed over to their own consuls. Christian missionaries were allowed everywhere. More huge indemnities. Hong Kong received the Kowloon Peninsula as an addition. Russia, acting as a peace mediator, received Primorai and the left bank of the Amur without firing a single shot. By 1860, China was completely defeated and economically subordinated to the British, French, and Americans. The nation was dying out and degrading. Opium addiction captured everything. The British even forced the Chinese to grow opium themselves on a massive scale under East India Company control. This is how the colonial division of Asia began. Indochina became a French colony. Burma became British. Attempts were made to occupy Thailand. Etc. Western powers sat there until the 1940s, 1950s of the 20th century. About the Americans separately. They did not fight in either opium war, but they profited enormously from the trade. One of the first big traders was a certain Forbes no relation to the Modern magazine. Another was Warren Delano, the grandfather of future U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He made a colossal fortune on opium in the 1830s, 1850s, returned to America, invested in railroads, mines, and oil, lost almost everything in the Panic of 1857, went back to China, earned even more now supplying both China and American Civil War hospitals, and rebuilt the family empire. When Franklin D. Roosevelt ran for president, the press briefly dug up the opium origins of the family wealth, but the story was quickly hushed up. A significant part of the fortunes of old American families, later invested in American industry and trade, originated from drug trafficking, just as in Britain. China remained addicted to opium for almost another 100 years, until Mao Zedong completely eradicated the problem in the late 1940s and early 1950s. That is why the Chinese call the period from roughly 1839 to 1949 the century of humiliation. From a country that possessed 35% of world GDP, they turned into a fragmented, poor, humiliated semi-colony torn by civil wars, deprived of territories, with a corrupted elite and a population hooked on drugs. Today, when you hear statements from the Chinese elite that the West has always been an enemy of a strong China, these are not inventions. The Chinese know perfectly well that many current members of the British House of Lords have ancestors who directly or indirectly participated in the opium trade and the humiliation of China. The Chinese remember everything perfectly and think in terms of thousands of years. Historical irony loves to play tricks. The British and Americans once forcibly addicted a country called China to heroin. Today, the overwhelming majority of synthetic drugs, especially fentanyl, that enter the United States and kill hundreds of thousands of Americans every year are produced in China. This is the story of the Opium Wars, which shows that behind any talk of open-door policy and free markets, there have always been the toughest economic and geopolitical interests of states. The strong always beats and humiliates the weak, and when the strong wins, he forces the weak to sign documents saying that the weak himself is to blame for everything. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to the channel. Keep watching our historical episodes. Goodbye.